there are natural times where the ego has to have its primary guiding principles re-examined, and often later in life, they have to be sacrificed so that something better, more expansive, more reflective of the maturity that we've gained can emerge.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, Joseph and I, as Lisa can't be here, are going to discuss an important life process and one that is critical in alchemy, part of our ongoing series of alchemical processes, and that is the process of mortificatio, or death. From a psychological point of view, it's the dark turning point, but when we are in that process, it doesn't feel like a turning point. It feels like the end, that we are just in the negredo, alchemical term for the blackness or depression. It's associated with shadow. It's associated with death. It's associated with putrefaction, dismemberment, all kinds of awful, dark things that we don't want to face, and yet we do in the course of a life. So what are the elements, psychologically speaking, that can die and may need to die when we experience mortificatio? Well, the first and most universal thing is it's some element of ego that usually has to accede to a force greater than itself. As we all know from Jung and others, one of the necessary conditions for humanity and being human is we develop an ego, and we need to develop an ego. But then it tends to arrogate to itself a sense of wholeness, power, authority, as if that's all that we are. And then we are going to run into these processes of mortificatio. The ego is often represented in alchemy as the king or the sun, the lion, the eagle, and other such symbols. One of the things that can die in the process of mortificatio is also our instinctual nature when it is leading us astray, such as perhaps a process of addiction. The dark, primal material that has perhaps not made it all the way into being integrated into ego. And that can be symbolized by the toad or a poisonous dragon, something that's very fleshy and material and unevolved, excrement, and so on. Another thing that can be subjected to the process of mortificatio is the lesser conjunctio of two things that are joined together but imperfectly. And this is often symbolized by things like marriage. It may be a career crisis, something we were drawn to, a person we loved, and then it's not perfect. We're not perfect. And that conjunctio that we projected onto a person, a situation, a career, has to suffer some kind of death of the original idea in order to move to something else. And another thing, the last on my list of all these things that can die, is the childhood state I think we can carry into very late years in life of purity or innocence or just idealism. And that's often symbolized by the sacrifice of something that is innocent. In the New Testament, Herod persecutes young children, 2 years old or younger, or the white sacrificial lamb, which is an early stage of sort of whiteness, but it needs to be tempered. With that as our mini framework for a very big, important, and difficult life process, let's see where we go. This Jungian Life Dream School is our year-long online program in the art of Jungian dream analysis. We offer guidance, instruction, and community as you learn to work more deeply with your dreams. There are 12 course modules, each with audio, video, and written materials, as well as a curated reading list. You'll be invited to join monthly live meetings with the three of us and to connect with fellow dream schoolers in our thriving online community. And this year, we are offering 10% off Dream School for the holidays. Just use the code HOLIDAY2025 when you check out anytime between now and the 31st of December. And you can also use this code to purchase Dream School as a gift for someone you love. Visit our website, thisjungianlife.com, to learn more, and we look forward to seeing many of you in Dream School in time for 2026.
So if we take that first position, which is that there are natural times where the ego has to have its primary guiding principles re-examined, and often later in life, they have to be sacrificed so that something better, more expansive, more reflective of the maturity that we've gained can emerge. So in one of the alchemical sequences of the Splendor Solus, there's an image of a young prince standing on the shore, and then far out in the lake, there's an old king that's flailing in the water and is, going down for the count. And one of the ways that that's interpreted is that we often don't realize that we have a core axiom and attitude right woven into the fundamentals of the personality. Often it's something that came into us very early in childhood even, and that becomes an orientation to ourselves and to life, and it takes us as far as it does. But as the self begins to assert and make demands on the ego, what we find is that old belief has been limiting us. Now, for most of us, it's very hard to put our hands on that kind of guiding principle that's been there for 50 years, let's say. But the self is keenly aware of the operating system that we've been running on. And at a certain point, it will intercede and start taking the life and libido away from that little nexus of images and beliefs, starve them, so to speak, which, as you had said, often leads to a temporary period of depression or confusion, and to be patient enough to wait and discover what the new and more comprehensive idea is. Now, talking about the death of an idea sounds so abstract, but if we understand that the central attitudes by which we perceive the world are captured as concepts and live inside us, that is a radical process.
Let's really illustrate this with some examples.
So one example that I could just toss out, because I just went through this with somebody I'm working with, is that if you're raised in a house where there's a lot of turbulence or trauma, sometimes the organizing attitude can be very primal, and it might sound like something like this. No. Just that.
Hmm.
Just that little gasp of, oh, no. And when that feeling and that word gets installed as a fundamental attitude towards the world, we see that later in life. That as opportunities or experiences present themselves, that the body kind of locks up, gasps, and initially interprets it as something that shouldn't be happening or that we don't want. And so we have a tendency to push life away. In our more sophisticated adult world, we're not aware of that gasp and that single word. But when we think about these very, very young moments where a guiding principle is installed, it often can sound and feel that primal. And if that's an attitude that's carried into the adult life, once we realize it, we can see how many things out of fear and startle and anxiety that we have rejected for no other reason than we have this echo from a very young time. And luckily, if we're gifted the moment to see that, we might notice that that needs to go and something better needs to replace it. That's one example I've been thinking about. What do you think, Deb?
I want to acknowledge how incredibly painful these experiences of mortificatio can be.
Mhm.
The degree of suffering and the amount of time that it can take. And the example that I can offer from my personal life is my first career as a special ed teacher.
Mhm.
And this is up for me because it came up in the context of something else just last week. And we worked with adolescents. They were not especially cute or adorable. And we loved them and kind of kicked their butts and had a wonderful team and wanted very, very much to support them in becoming and being who they were, and taking responsibility for decisions and choices. And needless to say, this program did not adhere to typical school rules of everyone sitting at a desk and working through a workbook. After 4 or 5 years, the powers that were decided to dismantle us.
Mm.
And the mortificatio was that honestly, I was on a quest. I was on the call to adventure a la Joseph Campbell. I was looking for the grail. I think all of us were as relatively young people. I think I was in my probably early 30s. And I was devastated. I can still feel my way into that period of life. And I wandered around doing wackadoodle part-time jobs for a couple of years before finding my way into something else. With all the feelings that you might imagine of, that it wasn't fair and so on and so forth. So mortificatio comes with grief and anger and a sense of injustice, and you can make a long list until something else emerged. But it is a hard time, and as I said at the beginning, somebody can write that it's about the dark turning point, but honestly, it felt much more like I was just lost in the forest.
That makes perfect sense. And when I think about how many people retire and then they fall into a Great Depression, it's ubiquitous, happens all the time.
Yeah.
And one way alchemy can help us is that it really is a kind of death of our identity or an aspect of our identity. And it's very it's very complicated. And as you were saying, it's very painful and deserves a kind of grieving process, which really is the process of letting something go or watching it leave, frankly, and then waiting the way one waits in the winter and watching to see what's going to sprout when the weather turns warmer. And often we don't know what's under the ground. We don't know what the next chapter necessarily is. We could determine it, but as Jungians, we might encourage you to rest into the wintering, to rest into the mortificatio, and to wait and watch so that whatever the next chapter is, it feels like it rises organically from a deeper field.
And I would say also that we can, in the process, although I didn't know this then, reflect on what exactly is dying.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was an idealistic, innocent kind of belief in helping people that needed help,
Yeah.
and that all the powers in the school system were aligned with our particular vision for that, which they were not. In the case that you just mentioned, Joseph, somebody who could suffer a mortificatio upon retiring, it may be the identification. Not that all these things are not mixed up together; they are. But if somebody has really held a position of leadership, skill, all the investment of all those years at work, that is an ego attitude that is going to die. Now, you're just so and so, and nobody knows who you were at work and what you could do. You're going out in the world as yourself. But it helps if you can to reflect on, what is it that I have just lost? What died? What died? And we see this in dreams all the time, don't we? Of that somebody's pet died, somebody's friend dies. The list is goes on and on and on of something dying. And people can often come in and say, "Oh my God, I had the most awful dream." What was being symbolized by this particular death?
So another death, which again is ubiquitous, is getting a divorce. 50% of marriages end in divorce. Sometimes both partners are in agreement. They've been talking for a long time, but it's not uncommon for one partner to be very surprised and the other to feel very determined. The loss of a marriage very much can feel like a death. And all of the mourning processes, the mourning of the fantasies, the breaking down of the internal image.
Mhm.
Because if we've been partnered for a long time, we have an internal image of ourselves and the partner are held together as a single idea. And when the partner is gone, there is a melting down of an internal representation, which sounds very abstract, but in the immediate sense, it is agonizing. We don't know who we are. We don't know what to take back into our own hands. We don't know whether love will ever come back, and etc. But as you were saying, what's dying? How do I sit in it? How do I not avoid it? Because the avoidance can look like a lot of things we're all familiar with. I'm not dead. I'm driving a brand new red convertible. I'm not dead. I'm going to put all of my retirement into crypto. See what happens. Let's roll the wheel. So there are ways that we will try to gin up life to avoid the natural grieving process, the withering process that must happen in order for us to rest down into the mulching of the old life.
And that, your example of a divorce or long-term relationship of any kind, a bad breakup, as they say, is the Mortificatio of the lesser conjunctio.
Yes, yes.
In alchemy, it's two substances that each of which has not been sufficiently purified. Now that's all of us in our human condition, and they unite, in all the feelings that go with partnering and commitment until and unless those impurities, speaking alchemical ease here, really interfere with the partnering, the conjunctio, the joining together. It's a very difficult and sad process, and it can be like all of these assaults on our ego, which knows how it was, quote, supposed to be. It really is a job in itself to convert that into mourning of just the sadness and the loss of an idea, an aspiration, a love, a purpose, to simply be sad at its loss rather than going into ego and saying, this wasn't right. I'm going to fight it. I'm going to litigate it. I'm going to continue to protest it rather than let ourselves be sad. And as ever, as someone said to me, what have you learned from this? My first thought was, what are you talking about? But what do we extract from it? How do we use it? How do we make new meaning from all of these incredible hardships that life can land on us?
And this is where alchemy can be so helpful and containing, because when we understand the alchemical stages, what we see is that these are stages. I think what happens when we're in something that's very painful is that we lose the arc of time and process. So, oh my gosh, I'm in the middle of divorce. I feel terrible. I guess this is the new norm, that I'm just going to be feeling bad forever. We don't always think that consciously, but unconsciously, people can really think this is now how it's going to be. But alchemy gives us some confidence that this is a sequence and that we can trust the sequencing. There's a wonderful alchemical phrase that I'm sure I'm going to pronounce poorly. Corruptio unis generatio est alterius.
Well, you get points for attempting it.
Thank you. I think you're supposed to say it with an Italian accent, is how I've been coached. Corruptio unis generatio est alterius. The corruption of one form is the generation of another. And if we can wrap our hands around that, or perhaps find evidence of that in previous changes that perhaps have been thrust upon us, then we might have some confidence that something is going to be generated out of the detritus of the old attitude, the old career, the old relationship, that becomes a kind of soil for the next thing. And if we can cling to that with some confidence and perhaps find evidence of it also, so it's not purely theoretical, we can weather the wintering, we can weather the dying process with some confidence. So we've talked a little bit about the lesser mortificatios, the death of a career, death of a marriage. Puberty, by the way, is also a mortificatio. The death of the child, the death of the innocent one. And that's, replaced by these kind of roaring sexual demands inside of us. All very natural, in a sense. The greater mortificatio, which Jung talks about in the Rosarium woodcuts, is when the ego is being prepared to receive the influx of influence from the self, that there is that transpersonal part of us that is trying to marry our ego and create this new amalgam of conscious and unconscious material, what Jung suggested is that the barrier between the conscious and the unconscious mind thins so that there is kind of a unified spectrum between the waking and the sleeping mind, or the conscious and the unconscious, that doesn't have such a sharp demarcation as it needs to in the first half of life. That the unconscious is in constant dialogue with us throughout the course of the day and the night. Jung suggested that he had attained this, and this was one of his explanations as to why he no longer dreamed in the latter years of his life. He said, I'm talking to the unconscious all day long. There's not a lot left to figure out when I'm asleep. So my sleep is generally just deep and dreamless. So there is an idea that we could unify the right and left sides of the brain, the ego and the unconscious, the masculine and the feminine, however we language the polarities, into a more unified spectrum of consciousness, and that requires a melting down or a mortificatio of the old way of functioning. And that's the greater and the more radical mortificatio that not all of us attain, actually.
I think what you're leaning into, Joseph, that is really important goes to these great, grand, old traditions of the Asclepion or the healing chambers. There were something like 250 and more of these healing chambers around the Levant, around the Mediterranean, ruled over by the god Asclepios. And I'm just going to read a little bit that talks to this greater mortificatio and its other side of the polarity of its function as healing and wholeness. So it starts with Greek mythology, and I'm reading from a book by Edward Edinger called Anatomy of the Psyche. We'll put all these in the show notes. So it says that the crow, which is a symbol of mortificatio, in Greek mythology appears as the birth of Asclepios. His mother was Coronis, the crow maiden, who, while pregnant with Asclepios by Apollo, had intercourse with Isis. This infidelity was reported to Apollo by the crow, who was turned from white to black for bringing bad news. Coronis, the mother, was killed for her crime, but the infant Asclepios was snatched from her womb while she was on the funeral pyre by Apollo. As has been demonstrated from a mythology named Karenyi has demonstrated, the birth of healing power from the negredo, the blackness, belongs to the archetype of the wounded healer. In his words, the myth refers psychologically to the capacity to be at home in the darkness of suffering and there to find germs of light and recovery with which, as though by enchantment, bring forth Asclepios, the sun-like healer. So people would go to these Asclepions, speak with a priest, ask for a healing dream, and descend into the unconscious in a whole sort of method of preparation, and then having the dream interpreted to find something in that darkness of the unconscious. And Peter Kingsley, again, they'll be in the show notes. I'm rereading his book, In the Dark Places of Wisdom, in which he talks about this process of the Asclepions as a way of dying before you die. Of that we need to find, as the ancients did, a way to sink into what Jung would call the collective unconscious, to let go of ego and to surrender and to suffer. And that, I think, is the huge challenge of Mortificatio. Can we let go? Can we let ourselves drop? Jung writes about this in Memories, Dreamers, Reflections, that he wrestled and wrestled and wrestled with these terrible, intrusive thoughts. And then one day he says, I let myself drop. Do we trust the unconscious? And when these hard times come upon us, either from the outside or as a result of our own internal imbalance, can we suffer it? Can we go through it?
And some suffering is foisted upon us, like we said, an unwanted divorce, getting fired, getting a serious medical diagnosis. Sometimes it's something that we choose. We decide we're going to do a big change. And then maybe we're surprised by how painful the change is, but we're the ones who kind of took it on as a heroic determination. But what you're saying, Deb, is that the ability to tolerate the mortificatio takes a certain kind of muscle, a kind of spiritual muscularity, which Jung sometimes called a crucifixion. Inasmuch as we're caught between two things, we don't know what the new thing is yet. And so we bear it, and we sit in the not knowing, the agonizing not knowing.
I have to say, my experiences, I don't know that I could ever claim that I went through any of them with a kind of muscularity versus simply having to be in it, because it just engulfed me. And again, I think I don't want to ever minimize just how hard it is. And it's not as if something else appears like, the happy ending in a fairy tale. And yet, as you said before, Joseph, it is part of a process. It is part of a circulatio, a process that goes around and in and above and on and through and weaves its way with us.
And that it is natural, that this is central to the way human beings are shaped, so to speak, which is why when Jung discovered the various alchemical writings, his first experience was recognition. Because these are familiar to me. These themes, these symbols, they've been showing up in the dreams of an Alice Sands. And as he began to psychologize the symbolism, he began to really appreciate how this was an accurate map of how we change as human beings. Having the map presents a level of meaning. Symbols offer us ways of containing affect and also organizing our suffering in a certain way, and helps us lay claim to the arc of change. And I think all of that helps us. It helps us surrender a little bit more gracefully, maybe. It helps us keep a sharp eye out for what's emerging, to be able to look for what's hatching and what's gaining steam inside of us, and perhaps gives us the confidence to rest into the dying and putrefying process. So there's a dying, which is that something is broken down. Often it's the dominant ego position that we need to outgrow. And then there's a rotting process, which is called the Putrefactio, which is that breaking down of the old thing. And like most other putrefactions, it releases the toxins in a thing. So often there might be the swift killing, my God, I just got fired. And then as that all as that churns inside of us and it breaks down, there is kind of a temporary sickness that we feel, and this goes to the serpent as well, that the bite of the serpent is both poison and medicine at the same time. And the truth, let's say, of getting fired because, we didn't fulfill expectations is a painful, venomous fact that we don't want to look at. It eats away at various inappropriate attitudes that we've been harboring, and it makes room for something new and better, ideally, to emerge. So the putrefaction to me is that brooding. We go over it over and over again, and we make ourselves a little sick as we think about this and brood on that and shake our fists against the gods and fight it and then don't fight it and then hate everybody and then beg everybody for help. And all of that agonizing, roiling process to me is part of that breaking down process.
Yeah, that I really kind of like that, Joseph. As sort of odious as the process of putrefaction can be, that there is that breaking down of the old attitude, and that the going over it and going over it and going over it is part of that. That in that process we're grinding things down to a level that where they can be metabolized, that we're working through something, and it can be something where it feels like we're just stuck on it, of like, oh, are you going to talk about this again? How unfair and awful it was to be fired, all these various life events that are difficult, and yet we're called to endure that process of putrefaction, the breaking down of the old attitude.
You had talked about the raven or the crow, the blackbird, and we associate, since ancient times, the crow and the raven with death in as much as they are carrion-eating birds.
Right.
So yes, particularly in Europe, after the battle is fought, it's the crows and the ravens that are eating the flesh. Now that represents intrapsychically that instinctive response, that something inside of us on a very primal instinctive level knows how to eat up the energy of the old thing, to pick the old attitude apart and digest it, because part of the putrefaction is also metabolizing. So the crow eats the dead thing, but also integrates it and turns it into flight and laying eggs and raising babies and an ongoing life that rises out of the dead thing.
Yeah. And that's the goes back to that Greek myth of the birth of Asclepios, and these healing chambers in which something dies so that something can be healed. This odd, unbelievable juxtaposition of death and new life.
Now, I'd like to go back to something that you had said in the introduction, Deb, which is that there's a way of being curious about instincts and the Mortificatio. And that, as we see, sometimes our natural instincts can become trapped in a complex. And then the energy of the instinct becomes co-opted by something that can be, useless sometimes, but sometimes life-threatening. As you were saying, in addiction, that the instinct, which in and of itself is clean or pure or natural, has been co-opted by something that is dangerous, like an addiction. But it could look like any number of other things. And so the instinct then has to be put into the alchemical vase. It needs to be corked and kept tight. And then as the instinct is frustrated, we're not letting the genie out of the bottle quite yet. In some alchemical drawings, it becomes a dragon, and then it becomes an angel, and then it's red, and it's green, and it's roaring, and then it's quiet. And all of those things speak to how intense it is to say no to ourselves, but then also to watch with curiosity what happens in our fantasy life when we restrain the improperly canalized instinct. So let's say that some analysts believe that addiction in and of itself is an impulse towards transcendence. Because if we drink enough, there's a way in which the ego is taken offline. The boundaries of the ego are reduced. The unconscious has a lot more free reign, and we find ourselves dancing at the office party with a lampshade on our head, or things that are far less charming than that, by the way. And there's a sense of that being important, maybe even miraculous, that it's so wonderful to feel liberated from all restraint. But doing that only with alcohol is a ritual that can eventually kill our bodies, destroy our livers, create all kinds of problems. So, right impulse, wrong ritual. And so the instinct to want to be more, the instinct to want to be free, to be more than I was, to be beyond the neurotic limits that I experience suffocating me day to day, good impulse. We would need to contain the destructive expression of it long enough to discover that the true impulse is to transcend, to be more than we were. And that would need to be experienced in a very real way so that it's not academic. And in that moment, the instinct can lead us to reimagine how it could be in service to our growth. And in order for it to be reimaged, that we would have to suffer the agony of burning away the inappropriate or negative way in which it's been captured. And Jung talks about this when he is writing about the flighted and the unflighted raven, which shows up in one of the Rosarium woodcuts. And what he's suggesting is that the raven that's poking its head out of the ground represents the instinct when it's churning and trapped in the container and it's not allowed to express itself. The flighted bird that meets the unflighted bird beak to beak represents the spiritualized clarity of what the instinct actually wants for itself, not the distorted thing that the culture or our trauma from our childhood have limited it. And when the instinct and the spiritualized possibility of its expression meet, then all kinds of new options emerge.
You know, I'm going back to your talking about the alchemical retort, the glass container that in every high school chemistry class, somebody was designed to break one.
Yes.
Or the cork would pop off because nobody followed, the one kid didn't follow the instructions. But the alchemical process of fermentation and what can be distilled out of that, what emerges, it's such a vivid image of things roiling around in this container and keeping the cork in for transformation to occur. The alchemists talked all the time about torturing the substances with which they worked, so that this is a process that is agonizing, that if it can be endured, can lead to the very transcendence that may have been inappropriately or wrongly sought. And I want to make a rather artless segue into the archetypal dimensions of some of this, of how these opposites and how this kind of process is depicted with the various dying gods of Osiris, who was dismembered. Dionysus, that I know you can elaborate on, Joseph, and Christ. They are not the only ones, but illustrating this process of mortificatio, and that archetypally something new is born.
And often it is the incorruptible thing that is born. So if we take the mythopoetic story of Jesus, and I'm framing it in that way so that we don't need to wonder about the historic relevance, but really taking it at an archetypal level. We have this rabbi, this teacher, who has a divine purpose, so we think, and that somehow Jesus has absorbed the full prima materia of the world. All the darkness of the world has been taken in by this extraordinary person, and that they are going to suffer the mortificatio that we can't suffer or don't know how to suffer. And by observing this God-like man suffer that which we can't and die with it, that we are somehow transformed. And in that transformation, Christ takes all of that darkness, resolves it into its spiritual components, and then comes back and offers us grace. But the grace is the substance of the sin that has been brought into the light of unmaking, which we call forgiveness, and reissued in the form of grace, which shows up in artwork as the Pentecost, when all of the apostles suddenly have these little flames suspended above their head. And that is the return of the grace out of which the sin has been transformed in the alchemical process.
You know, though, to go back to the mortificatio, part of that, it's so, one of the difficulties with this whole topic is that we do tend not to stick with the mortificatio because we are waiting for the new thing, the transformation, new life, new understanding, whatever it might be. And yet it's a grim process. Think about being nailed to a cross. And Jesus says, to God, "Why hast thou forsaken me?"
Right.
There are no guarantees here. We have to simply surrender, because our egos cannot do it, bear it, fight it, change it. We are forced to our knees, metaphorically speaking. And we have the stories, the Christian myth, Osiris, Dionysus. So I'm thinking about, really going back to the very beginning where we started, of that we surrender our egos. It's not that we don't go through our day and mow the lawn and get the oil change in the car, and all the things that we have to do. But the knowing in Mortificatio is ego really is not running this show. That's just the truth of it.
And I think that integrating the idea that the ego is not running the show, even when it thinks that it is preparing us for the Mortificatio, although in and of itself it is not the Mortificatio. That by taking in wisdom, whether we're reading Jung or reading something else, that is a preparation so that when the self asserts and begins to pull energy away, because we can't do that ourselves, that we have an understanding of the process, and that understanding grants us a kind of muscularity to tolerate a process. And this is something that Viktor Frankl helped us understand, that we are capable of withstanding tremendous amounts of suffering, mind-boggling amounts of suffering, if we understand what it means, or if we can discover meaning inside of it. So one of the things that Jung does that's so wonderful, and alchemy offers that as well, is that it is meaningful and not meaningless. And so when the dying happens, we have some preparation for it.
Well, just to say for people who might not be familiar, Viktor Frankl was imprisoned in a German concentration camp during World War II and survived to tell the tale in a book called Man's Search for Meaning. So you can take a look at that if you're so inclined. It'll be in the show notes. I'm wrestling, honestly, Joseph, with the juxtaposition of the experience of simply suffering and falling into a mortificatio and a grado, a place of helplessness and darkness, with your idea about muscularity and thinking about it and finding the meaning, and how those two things work together or don't. I don't know that I can claim for myself that in some of the dark places that I felt very muscular. I didn't.
And I understand that, as do we all, that we're not gifted with preparation necessarily. But I think that one of the reasons that we study this kind of work is that it offers something that we may not have had access to when we were much younger, where we were just treading water and hoping we don't drown, psychologically speaking, because we didn't have a philosophy when we're 20, let's say, and vicissitudes rip the carpet out from under us. But there still is a process inside because the archetypes pre-exist. The whole alchemical sequence is stored in the collective unconscious and activates of its own accord or for some mysterious way that we don't understand, and then carries us in some regard. The difference between being carried by the archetype or co-participating has to do with the acquisition of wisdom. It's still not a process that we have our hands on totally, but over time we may acquire a kind of wisdom that helps us bear. And I think this could be seen in the Gethsemane moment, where Christ goes out into the wilderness and prays to God and says, "Let this cup pass me by. This is too horrible, basically. This is beyond me." And then there's a moment where he realizes he could step out of this. He could refuse this. But he submits to the self and says, "Not my will, but thine be done." And then the whole mortificatio process, putrefactio, and resurrection then occurs, but there is a moment where there is a choice to submit to a process, which in the theological writing is a process that he is aware of, although has not experienced yet.
Yeah. So you're talking about the sojourn in the desert and then the experience with the disciples, but the common thread is the submission. And you touched on something that I think can be, a place where we come to a good stopping place, which is the acquisition of wisdom, which, from what I have read, is really about letting go of the identification with ego, not its use for our lives as sort of our life administrator, but letting go of the identification with ego that can be foisted upon us by external life events, and it can come from within. Something pressures us and grows and demands, but we're forfeiting ego as the primary source of our identification. We are part of something bigger. We are part of something that is beyond our understanding. Our egos are not the sole arbiters, directors, and have the sole power over how our lives will unfold. And there's a kind of humility in that of, well, here I am still, and that we will see where the rest of the alchemical symbols and sequence, unfold in our lives. I like that idea of wisdom rather than something that is only intellectual.
Right. Or the bad advice that we might receive on how to escape the change process, which Jung called the regressive restoration of the persona. That in the change in the death process, just like the Gethsemane moment, you may sense that there's a way to flee the death process and go back to the old way. Let that cup pass you by. And again, having some wisdom might give you the confidence to not flee the process. And that is a precious gift that Jung has given us.
So this may be a good time to turn to the wisdom of our dream maker and see what we can look into and try to understand.
And before we jump into that, I'd like to remind everybody that we have a program that we've designed with you in mind to put you into relationship with your dreams, to be able to embrace and take in the transformative medicine of your dreams. It's called Dream School. If you go to our website, thisjungianlife.com, on the top banner, click Dream School, and you'll receive a bunch of information about how the program works. The feedback we've gotten over the several years that we've been running Dream School is universally positive and useful. There's a community of really wise and dedicated fellow aspirants, as well as the three of us who do live events so that you can have access to us as well. And we would like to meet you there. So our dream today is a 33-year-old female. She works as a yoga teacher and grocery store clerk, and here is her dream. I'm in a ruined city, and I know that it's the apocalypse. Me, my father, and my two brothers are taking shelter in an abandoned store, and there are other people with us, maybe another family. It is chaos, and everyone is deciding how they want to die. At some point, my father gets up and leaves us, and we know that he has gone out to shoot himself, and this is how he's chosen to go. I walk out of the store and down the road to the hospital where my mother is dying of cancer. When I walk into the hospital, I meet a doctor who is taking care of the patients. I ask her if there is a way to go that doesn't involve pain, and she says yes, that this is what they're giving to the patients. She gestures towards the bed, and I see my mother lying as if asleep. She is hooked up to an IV. And then I look back at the doctor, and she shows me her own arm. She is also hooked up to an IV and has also chosen this drug as a method of death. I go over to my mother, and for a moment I see that she looks uncomfortable or in pain. But then it passes, and she looks completely peaceful. I sit on the bed and hold her, but I know that she has died. It is a very beautiful moment. My mother's skin is pale and glowing, and she looks peaceful and content. There is light all about us. At this moment, I know this is how I want to die, to take this drug and to lie on the bed holding my mother, the two of us together. However, somehow I know that now is not the right time. So I get up and walk back out of the hospital. It seems like time passes, and now I'm standing outside a city apartment block at nighttime. The lights of the apartment block are all glowing. I look different, with shorter hair, and I'm talking to my mother. My mother isn't there, I know she's dead, yet I am talking to her and telling her that there are still people who are alive and that not everything has died. I tell her that I know how I want to die and I still want to be with her, but maybe I don't have to leave right now. Maybe I should stay a little bit longer here and try to do some of the things I had wanted to do in my life before the apocalypse happened. It's like I need to explain it to her. I think of my brothers and realize I don't know what happened to them, though I imagine they both chose violent ways to die. The dream ends with me standing there, looking at the sky. For context, she writes, my mother was diagnosed with leukemia 5 years ago and has recently been told that it's progressed and there is now little that the doctors can do for her. At the time of the dream, both of my brothers had come back home as she was undergoing some very aggressive treatment, and we were told there was a risk she would not survive. So me, my father, and brothers were lying back at the family home and going in to visit my mother, who is still with us, though weak and recovering in hospital. She says the main feelings in her dream were a sense of purpose. I knew I wanted a different mode of death from the other people in the city and was glad when I found the doctor. Sadness, but also relief and peace when my mother died. And then a sense of curiosity and hope at the end when I realized not everyone had died. And maybe there was still something I could do with my life. She gives us a bit more and writes, at the end of the dream, I was also reading the novel The Road by Cormac McCarthy. The book has a powerful effect on me, and I felt it was a source of help and strength at a dark time. So quite a Mortificatio dream. So the first thing I'd like to offer the dreamer and the listeners is the word apocalypse is often misunderstood. It means revelation. So if we take it at its true meaning, that the psyche has offered a revelation, an insight, something that was hidden is now known. And the power of the thing that is now revealed has deconstructed great swaths of her psychology, that things that she used to believe, things that she used to pursue, have been disrupted by the revelation of something. And in the midst of this powerful revelation, there are decisions to be made.
What I'm thinking about here a lot is that the dream actually has to do with the family complex. Of what is dying, what is being threatened, and the ending that we commonly associate with the word apocalypse, and then its underlying meaning of what is being revealed, as you have helpfully informed us. This is grim times, and it's echoed by her having been so powerfully affected by the Cormac McCarthy novel, The Road, which is a dystopian journey of a father and son trudging, they hope, toward freedom after some sort of awful world event. I remember having read it some years ago, and it certainly is a powerful book. But here is the dream ego is surrounded by death. The mother is dying. The father does die. Mother dies. Brothers are, she doesn't know where they are. And I'm thinking about whether there is a differentiation here from some way of identifying, belonging, conceiving herself as part of this nuclear family. And the dream ego, after all the things that go on, decides that she's not going to die. She says, now is not the right time to die. Time passes. There is a way that she can still communicate with her mother or her mother complex. Not everything has died. Maybe I should stay a little longer here on Earth and do some of the things I wanted to do. So I wonder if there is this is an individuation theme that is running through the family complex and differentiating itself from it.
That makes good sense and grounds it in something that's very accessible. That the death of a parent is a massive, massive event. Even if we've been estranged from a parent, to at one point discover that you are no longer the child of anyone, that everything about your life rolls into your own hands with a new authority when the parents have passed away. I want to bring up an uncanny bit in the dream because I'm very interested when words repeat. And I'm trying to unpack this in my mind. I know she has died. It's a very beautiful moment. My mother's skin is pale and glowing. The lights of the apartment block are all glowing. So there's something interesting in the remnant of the mother, that the mother's life force is still luminous, although the vessel of the mother is inert. And then we have the image of the apartment building, and apartment buildings in and of themselves are inert shells, but there is a glowing light inside of the inanimate thing, which is still visible and glimpsing what is secretly luminous inside of the vessel, gives her a new attitude and makes her question, what is death? Is death exclusively changes to the container, changes to the vessel? And if the vessel of life changes, does that mean there's no life? Or is there still a luminous reality that exists separate from the vessel, even when the vessel has become inert? And to me, that's a very profound religious experience, even though it may sound rather ordinary in the telling of it. But the comparison between the mother and the apartment buildings seem relevant to me.
Yeah. And she says, I look different with shorter hair, talking to my mother, even though my mother isn't there. not everything has died.
and that the outer seeming of things can change radically. But it doesn't mean the life force itself is gone or that we no longer have any access to life. So the apocalyptic revelation in the beginning of the dream may very well point to the news from the mother's doctor, which is that the prognosis is we cannot do anything else to prolong the life of your mom. That is a revelation that can create this massive change in our psychological life. And then there's a concern that the spirit of death is going to move through the entire family complex or through the entire psychological life. And she is seduced initially to want to follow her mother into death. So just to sit with that, that's probably not something that the dreamer was necessarily consciously pondering, but the dream maker is looking at her from the inside out and saying, there is a secret attitude about following your mother into death that needs to be looked at consciously. It needs to be held consciously so it doesn't creep up on you and trick you into doing something that is very self-destructive, which could hurt her. So by seeing it dramatized in the dream, then she can ponder it consciously and perhaps break its spell, because she does come to the realization that I don't need to follow my mother into death. And maybe the true spirit of her is still alive, and she has that experience that she can talk to the mother imago in her psyche, which is still a vibrant set of memories, ideas, and images that are alive and well in her soul, so that the fear that all would be darkness, that there would be nothing left if she couldn't relate to the outer mother, is disproved in the dream.
This is a really, it's a big dream around a time in this dreamer's life that is, of course, very, very sad and painful. It's apocalyptic in the sense that something so big is happening, the death of one's mother. It's really huge, as you've acknowledged too, Joseph. And there are the dream images of the glowing. I can talk to her. I am different.
The other thing which pervades the dream is the power of choice. The dream is full of choices. Now, the mother is subject to this terrible and devastating illness. She is not given choice, although there may be some choice as to how much comfort care is provided, and in that way there is choice. But she can choose life or not. The father can choose life or not. The doctor, the brothers. There is eros and thanatos. Life, relationship, love, eros, or death, the abdication of those things, and then the retreat into whatever else is there. And the whole dream is sitting with this capacity of choice, of dramatic, intense, extraordinary kind of choice. And in that last bit, she makes a choice. And she chooses eros, she chooses life, and she chooses to go on. And that is a choice for all of us. Yes, there is the mortificatio of the personality, but we can still choose life, to be alive, and to believe that there is still a luminous reality that is underneath the outer seeming of things. And to me, that is a kind of spiritual initiation, which I believe the dream is offering her.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.